All right, so this is our next video on grief, and this is our final video. And here I want to talk about what we can actually do to help a child when they're experiencing grief. One of the important things in helping a child is first noticing when they're experiencing grief. And at camp, often, especially early on, I completely missed it because children would say something like, "Yeah, my grandma died," and then they would pause and then they would go off onto something else. And often it's just these little hints where they're letting you know I have a sad spot here, but then they don't know what to do with that, and so they move on. And when we pause and actually ask questions and help them at that moment, there's a lot of healing that can happen. So I want to start by saying thank you to Dr. Leslie Matthews and John W. James and Russell Freeman, who wrote a book called When Children Grieve. That has been really helpful for us in our camp ministry and what we do with kids. And I really would recommend that book to you if you're interested in more in helping children grieve. In the book, one of the first stories they share is the story of a mom who had called in to a grief counselor, and she was wanting help because her son was grieving the loss of his dad, or her husband. And the counselor said, "Well, how are you doing with the loss of your husband?" And her response was, "I'm not worried about myself, I'm doing okay, but I'm really worried about my son. My son, whenever he gets remembers his dad, he gets really, really sad, and he won't talk about it." And so the counselor said, "So how are you doing?" And she said, I'm doing okay. What I'm really worried about is my son, because he won't talk about his grief. In fact, when he starts to get sad, he'll run to his room, he'll close his door, and he won't let me talk about it." And so the counselor says, "So how are you dealing with your grief when you feel sad?" And she said, "Well," she says, "I have to be strong for my son. So when I feel sad, I go to my room and I close my door." And when she said that, she realized, oh my goodness, my son's doing exactly what I'm doing. It's important as we talk about helping children grieve that we learn to embrace our own grief. If we don't embrace our grief, we're not going to be able to help kids with their grief. It's something we have to learn in order to teach. We have to learn in order to help. We all know the airplane attendant story where they say, if there's a loss of oxygen, a face mask will drop down. Adults first put on your face mask and then assist your children. Because they know that if a parent is assisting their child in putting on their face mask, the child might throw a fit. It might take a while. And once the parent passes out, there's nobody to help that child. On the other hand, the child if the parent puts their mask on first, the child can throw a fit for as long as they want. The parent's going to be okay. Either the child will pass out, then they'll put the mask on, or they'll be able to get the mask on. But the child will be okay because the adult has taken care of themselves first. And when we're able to grieve our own grief, then we can go into our children's grief. And it's not triggering, it's not stirring up pain in us that we can't handle because we already have begun the process and have learned to grieve ourselves. So the first story I want to tell was from actually this past summer. It's a bit of a funny, interesting story, I should say. We were down at the Leave It Behind, and the children had taken rocks and wrote down the names of loved ones that had died, and they had placed it in front of a cross, and we had a prayer together. And the children were heading back up to the building But one of the children had stayed behind, and I could tell that she was sad, and the counselor was beside her, comforting her. Um, but that counselor didn't quite know what to do in that moment, so I came alongside them, and I asked, we'll call her Emily. I said, Emily, looks like you're really sad. Who are you missing right now? And she said, I'm crying for my aunt. And that's often interesting. And so I said, well, what happened to your aunt? And she said, well, she drowned. And then I said, how old was your aunt? I just wanted to get a feeling. And she said, well, my aunt was 2. So of course my mind's thinking, okay, so how did you even know your aunt? So I said, well, um, you know, I think I said, how long did you know your aunt? And she said, well, I knew my aunt since she was born. My grandmother decided to adopt a baby. And so that was my aunt. And then she started sharing that her dad was upset that his mom had decided to adopt. And so he had cut off communication with his mom. And so here she is, she's carrying all this grief. Her dad isn't accepting the grief that she's experienced, and she's in a lot of pain. And so, then I started just asking her questions, and one of the helpful things when somebody's experiencing grief is to kind of put yourselves in their shoes and imagine what it would have been like. And so, I asked her how long ago it was, and I think it was like a year ago that her aunt had drowned. And so, I talked about that must have been really special, being able to introduce your aunt to friends, or at least the thought of being able to introduce your aunt to friends. And here, this is the baby, and this is my aunt. And of course, there's the whole looking forward to being a big sister and kind of a big sister figure and all of that. And as we unpack that, she stopped crying, but she started remembering, and we embraced the sadness of the story together, and that was very, very healing for her. So, when a child has expressed grief, whatever it is, the first part is just taking time to really understand their loss. And that might be, just who is this person? What did they mean to you? And there's kind of 2 types of losses. There's the loss where they were really close, and now that person's gone, or their pet's gone, or whatever. But then there's the other side of the loss where they weren't really close, and now that opportunity to be close is gone forever. And both losses are real. So taking time to understand what they're grieving. One of the things that is often helpful is writing a grief letter, but I often do verbal grief letters. And so the first part of a grief letter is your earliest memory. So I often will ask a child who's sad, what was your first memories of your grandma or your pet, and let them talk about their first memories. And then I like to ask them, what did you like to do with your grandma? What were some special things that you did together? And so they can talk about some of those special things. And then I like to ask them, the next question is really an important question, but are there things that they did that you didn't like? When a person gets stuck in grief, they're stuck because that person hurt them. And now that person is dead, now that they're gone, they can never apologize. They can never come and say, I'm sorry for hurting you in this way. And so they're stuck with this sadness. And so when I ask the children this, it helps them express, they did do things that hurt me. And that is a reality. When we grieve, there's both the happy memories and the sad memories. There's the things that you loved about them, and there's the things you hated about them. And so, we would talk about that. And then I usually, because I've spent time talking and we're connecting, it's very easy to ask them, would you like to let go of that and go ahead and forgive them for what they did? They can never make it right. They can never fix it, but it doesn't mean you have to carry it forever. And we can let go of that today. And often a child's willing to do that, and that allows then their heart to continue to heal. So the flip side of this, we talked about forgiving the person who's hurt them and going there, and then the other side of it is are there things that you did that hurt that person? And so, often I'll ask a camper, are there things you did that you regret? Are there things that you've said or things that you've done to your grandma that you regret now and you wish you could say you're sorry? And that's the other place where people get stuck, where they hadn't done everything right, and now that person's gone forever, and now I can't go and say I'm sorry. And so then we can just do a short prayer there again, where they're able to say, God, I'm sad because I didn't do this for my aunt, or I didn't do this for my grandma, or I said these mean things. And I just want them to know that I'm sorry. And will you forgive me? And then that brings them to a place of healing again, where they can move on. Another part of that grief story then is, where were you when you found out what happened? And so that helps bring closure as well, and letting them share where they were when they found out grandma had cancer, where they were when they found out that grandma died. And then after that, I talk about what are some things you miss? What are some things you're going to miss about your grandma? And for a child who never knew their mom or never knew their dad very well, this is going to be a really healing part, as far as, so your dad's dead and he's gone forever. What are some things that you wish you miss doing with your dad, that you wish you could have done? And this brings healing in another way, where they're able to embrace the pain that they're experiencing with memories that they now won't experience. I had a camper one time. We were in one of our classes where we were talking about grief, and she'd drawn a grief picture about her dad. And her dad was shot in a drive-by shooting. He had just gotten out of prison that summer, and it was the fall, and there was a random shooting, and he died. And I remember her sharing her story, and she kind of she was pretty much together as she shared. She was a little sad. And then I said, your dad had just gotten out of prison, and you were looking forward to having a relationship with him now, weren't you? And now that's gone forever. And when I said that, she just burst into tears and just started crying. And for a lot of us, there's a feeling of, why did you do that? Now she's really crying. But we have to remember that grief is good. She was feeling all of that pain. It was there. It had just never been articulated for her. Nobody had ever given her words to express what she was feeling. And as I said that, it connected with her pain. And so she cried. She had a good cry there. And as our class wrapped up, I had a couple girls that were crying. It's like, what do I do? Ask God that question. God, how do I wrap up this class with these girls that are dealing with this grief? And then I remembered a story about my grandfather. He had Alzheimer's, and he was pretty old, but he always wore a cap because the light in the kitchen would bother him, and Grandma would always fuss over it. And I remember sitting there one time thinking about that, and I thought, poor Grandpa, he's old, he's forgetting things, and Grandma's just scolding him. And then I had the realization that in 2 minutes he'd completely forget everything that Grandma had said, and he'd be happy again. And so it was just kind of a funny thing about Grandpa. Um, and then I said, let's go around the room and share what our happy time today was and what our sad time today was. As we went around the room, it came to the girl who had lost her dad in the shooting. And she said, my sad time today was this class and being here. And then she paused and she said, my happy time today was this class and being here. Being able to be in a place where she could grieve and people could hear her sorrow and grieve with her was a healing thing for her. So I want to encourage you, as you're working with campers and they give you those little hints of sorrow and loss, or maybe they are just sad, maybe they're just sitting and crying, that you come alongside them and you ask them the questions and you take time to hear their story and just let them grieve. And as you do that, their hearts are going to heal. And you're modeling for them, whenever I feel sad, when I remember about Grandma, I can go ahead and go there and remember those memories. And that's actually going to bring healing and wholeness to my heart in a much greater way than pushing away and staying busy. And it also reminds the kids that they can grieve, that it's not a scary place to be, that it's actually warm and very comforting. Thank you for taking time to do this grief training with us. I want to encourage you to continue to grieve well in your own life, so that as you work with kids, you will be able to help them grieve well as well. God bless.